As the world continues to focus on his case, we'll focus on the content of the thousands of State Department cables that WikiLeaks is continuing to publish. One of the cables reveals that the pharmaceutical giant Pfizer hired investigators to dig up dirt on Nigeria's former Attorney General last year in an effort to pressure him to drop a $6 billion lawsuit against the company. The lawsuit stemmed from a notorious 1996 drug experiment Pfizer conducted on sick children in Nigeria. The high-profile case has been compared to the plot of the Academy Award-winning movie The Constant Gardener that was based on the best-selling novel by John le Carré.
In 1996, Pfizer's researchers selected 200 children at an epidemic hospital in Nigeria for an experimental drug trial. About 100 of the kids were given an untested oral version of the antibiotic Trovan. Researchers did not obtain signed consent forms, and medical personnel said Pfizer did not tell their parents their children were getting the experimental drug. 11 children died. Others suffered disabling injuries, including deafness, muteness, paralysis, brain damage, loss of sight, slurred speech. The details of the case were first exposed in 2000 in an investigative series in The Washington Post. In 2007, Nigerian officials brought criminal and civil charges against Pfizer in a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit.
A State Department cable from 2009 details a meeting between Pfizer's country manager, Enrique Leggeri, and U.S. officials in Abuja. The cable reads, according to Leggeri, Pfizer had hired investigators to uncover corruption links to Federal Attorney General Michael Aundaka to expose him and put pressure on him to drop the federal cases. A few months later, Nigeria settled with Pfizer for just $75 million.
Joe Stevens is a staff writer for The Washington Post. He was part of the investigative team that broke the story in 2000. He's joining us from the offices of The Washington Post in Washington, D.C. And we're joined here in studio by Musikulu Mojid, a Nigerian journalist who's worked on this story for the Next newspaper in Lagos. He's a Ford Foundation International Fellow at City University of New York here in the city. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Joe Stevens, let's start with you. Lay out the scope of this of the whole experiment that Pfizer did in Nigeria.
Well, this goes back 14 years. It's an amazing, twisted saga, and the WikiLeaks development is just the latest twist and a just amazing story. In '96, Pfizer was trying to get approval for a new antibiotic they thought was going to be a blockbuster drug. And as part of this, they wanted to test it on children because you could get an extension on your patent and make billions more potentially by testing on children. But it's very difficult to get children to take an experimental drug in the U.S. There's a lot of hoops to jump through. Parents are very protective. And this was a drug that had problems with young mammals. When it was given to rabbits and dogs that were not fully developed, they became arthritic and crippled. And so they were trying to put together the trials. And during this time, one of the lead researchers who was in charge of this drug called Trovan saw that there was a record meningitis epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. They very quickly, in a matter of weeks, put together a clinical trial, loaded up their experimental drug on a DC-9 and flew it to northern Nigeria. Generally, these pediatric trials, they can take years to put together. This was done very quickly. They arrived at one of the most disgusting, fetid hospitals in the world, according to Doctors Without Borders in Kano. And this hospital was besieged with patients, people bringing in their children, often carried on their backs to this epidemic camp. And Doctors Without Borders had set up there. They were using an approved drug to treat children. Pfizer came in, took over some wards, and started giving out their experimental drug. Half the children got Trovan, half got a proven drug, but they got a substandard dose. And Pfizer was there for a few weeks, tried out its drug, and flew back out. No one really knew, other than people who were in this hospital, knew this had taken place until we came in 4 years later in 2000 and did an investigative look at this. And what we found is that Pfizer had no written, signed, informed consent forms from parents which would prove that the parents knew that their children were taking experimental drug and had agreed to this. That's standard procedure in the West, in the U.S. and Europe. They didn't have these. Pfizer says, nonetheless, that parents knew what they were doing. Some people who were in the hospital at the time told us they had no idea what they were doing. They defended their trial and said that this was an ethical trial to do, partly because they had an ethics approval from Nigeria, and they gave us a copy of this report. We later found out that this was not a real ethics approval letter, that the letterhead it was composed on didn't exist at the time of the trial. And later, the lead investigator for Pfizer in Nigeria acknowledged to us that when there was an FDA audit in the U.S., Pfizer had called and said, we need a copy of this ethics approval letter immediately. He went to his office, put it together, signed it himself, backdated it a number of years, and then sent it over to Pfizer headquarters. So this has been going on for a long time. After our stories, there was an official federal investigation in Nigeria, but it was never made public. It disappeared. And many years later, we finally got a copy of this report. It concluded that Pfizer had violated both Nigerian law and international law and was very critical. It also mentioned that members of the investigative panel had been the target of death threats during the investigation. We were told there were 3 copies of this report. Attorneys in the U.S. who brought a class action lawsuit said they had spent years trying to find this report that we came up with. One they tracked to a safe, and when they opened the safe, it was not there. Another was supposedly in the possession of a man who died before the lawyers got to him. After we made this report public, there was a new set of public officials in power in Nigeria, and they decided to bring criminal and civil charges against Pfizer, including homicide, both Pfizer and some current and former employees of Pfizer. The state of Kano in the northern Nigeria settled for $75 million. The federal charges, which initially were seeking $7 billion from Pfizer, just sort of evaporated. We never knew what happened to them. And now this new revelation comes out and raises very serious questions about why those charges just evaporated.
We're going to go to break, and then we will come back. We're talking to Joe Stevens, who's a reporter at the Washington Post, who broke this story with others in a long investigative series in the year 2000, and now they have surfaced again in this U.S. diplomatic cable that was released by WikiLeaks. We'll also be joined by a Nigerian journalist who's worked on this story, Musikulu Mujid. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with them in a minute.